Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to a series of videos in which I am reading you a book. We are reading Barchester Towers by Anthony Trollope, and we have met Mr. Arabin, who has come to take over church in the gift of Archdeacon Grantley in order to combat the evil Mr. Slope, and we have met the Squire Thorne of Ullathorne and his sister, and we have seen St. Ewell's. The new rector of St. Ewell's has gone over and looked at it and checked out its dilapidations. And now we get to chapter 23, in which a lot of those elements are brought together. So not a high drama chapter, but we'll see what we can make of it here on this beautiful, beautiful day. So this is chapter 23. Mr. Arabin reads himself in at St. Ewell's, which is the kind of the term for you're taking over a church you want to give your first service. You're reading yourself in to introduce yourself to your parish. On the Sunday morning, the Archdeacon with his sister-in-law and Mr. Arabin drove over to Ullathorne, as has been arranged. On their way thither, the new vicar declared himself to be considerably disturbed in his mind at the idea of thus facing his parishioners for the first time. He had, he said, been always subject to shyness and an annoying degree of bashfulness, which often unfitted him for any work of a novel description, and now he felt this so strongly that he feared he should acquit himself badly at St. Ewell's reading desk. He knew, he said, that those sharp little eyes of Miss Thorne would be on him, and that they would not approve. All this the Archdeacon greatly ridiculed. He himself knew not, and had never known, what it was to be shy. He could not conceive that Miss Thorne, surrounded as she would be by the peasants of Ullathorne and a few of the poorer inhabitants of the suburbs of Barchester, could in any way affect the composure of a man well accustomed to address the learned congregations of St. Mary's at Oxford, and he laughed accordingly at the idea of Mr. Arabin's modesty. Thereupon Mr. Arabin commenced to subtilize. The change, he said, from St. Mary's to St. Ewell's was quite as powerful on the spirits as would be that from St. Ewell's to St. Mary's. Would not a peer, who, by chance of fortune, might suddenly be driven to herd among the navvies, be as afraid of the jeers of his companions as would any navvy suddenly exalted to the seat among the peers? Whereupon the Archdeacon declared with a loud laugh that he would tell Miss Thorne that her new minister had likened her to a navvy, a commoner, in other words. Eleanor, however, pronounced such a conclusion to be unfair. A comparison might be very just in its proportions, which did not at all assimilate the things compared. But Mr. Arabin went on subtilizing, regarding neither the Archdeacon's raillery nor Eleanor's defense. Keeps ignoring her. A young lady, he said, would execute with most perfect self-possession a difficult piece of music in a room crowded with strangers, who would not be able to express herself in intelligible language, even on any ordinary subject, among her most intimate friends, if she were required to do so standing on a box somewhat elevated among them. It was all an affair of education, and he, at 40, found it difficult to educate himself anew. Eleanor dissented on the matter of the box, and averred that she could speak very well about dresses, or babies, or legs of mutton, from any box, provided it were big enough for her to stand upon without fear, even though all her friends were listening to her. The Archdeacon was sure she would not be able to say a word, but this proved nothing in favor of Mr. Arabin. Mr. Arabin said that he would try the question out with Mrs. Bold, and get her on a box some day when the rectory might be full of visitors. To this Eleanor assented, making condition that the visitors should be of their own set, and the Archdeacon cogitated in his mind whether by such a condition it was intended that Mr. Slope should be included, resolving also that, if so, the trial would certainly never take place in the rectory drawing room at Plumstead. So arguing, they drove up on the iron gates of Ullathorne Court. Trollope says so arguing, but the scene easily admits of this being done in jest, of everyone laughing the whole time. You could easily read it that way, as that Trollope is being figurative when he says arguing, and that these characters are actually just railing with each other for fun. The image of standing on a box in the middle of Plumstead Rectory in order to talk about legs of mutton certainly lends itself to that reading. Mr. and Mrs. Thorne were standing ready, dressed for church in the hall, and greeted their clerical visitors with cordiality. Trollope can't resist the fact that once you open the door, you have stumbled into the hall, because even though he spent 150,000 pages on that in the last chapter, he has to let you know that when you get to Ullathorne Court, you open the front door and boom, you're in the hall. Okay, we get it. It's not all that weird. You could give it up, for Pete's sake. The Archdeacon was an old favorite of the Ullathorns, in other words, who are arch conservative. So you have to wonder what they think of every one of the characters that we've met. The Archdeacon was an old favorite. He was a clergyman of the old school, and this recommended him to the lady. He had also been an opponent of free trade as long as free trade was an open question, and now that it was no longer so, he, being a clergyman, had not been obliged, like most of his lay Tory companions, to read his recantation. He could therefore be regarded as a supporter of the Immaculate 53, and was on this account a favorite of Mr. Thorne. The little bell was tinkling, and the rural population of the parish were standing about the lane, leaning on the church stile against the walls of the old court, anxious to get a look at their new minister as he passed from the house to the rectory. The Archdeacon's servants had already preceded them thither with the vestments. Again with the stiles, again with the lane, again with the wall. And you might not know what that reference is to the little bell is tinkling. A lot of versions of this book that I've read don't give a note for it. It was just a way to summon the local populace to service, even though they knew the time. They knew perfectly well when the service was. That's all you can tell from context. You don't need to worry about it. The whole point of this paragraph, for instance, just as a way of decreasing your anxiety about this whole book, the whole point of this paragraph is twofold. One, to let you know that the Thorns of Ullathorne approve of Mr. and Mrs. Grantley, and of the new head of St. Ewald's, and also to let you know that the whole of the parish or the diocese or the congregation or whatever are interested to see Mr. Arabin. They haven't seen him yet. They all went forth together, and when the ladies passed into the church, the three gentlemen tarried a moment in the lane, that Mr. Thorne might name to the vicar some kind of the one-sided introduction, the most leading among his parishioners. Here are churchwardens, Mr. Arabin, Farmer Greenacre, Mr. Stiles. Mr. Stiles has a mill as you go into Barchester, and very good churchwardens they are. Not very severe, I hope, said Mr. Arabin. The two ecclesiastical officers touched their hats, and each made a leg in the approved rural fashion, assuring the vicar that they would be very glad to have the honor of seeing him, and adding that the weather was very good for the harvest. Mr. Stiles, being a man somewhat versed in town life, had an impression of his own dignity, and did not quite like leaving his pastor under the erroneous idea that he, being a churchwarden, kept the children in order during church time. That's what Arabin means. He hears churchwarden and thinks, oh, you take care of the children. You make sure the children aren't running up and down the aisles. When actually these churchwardens have a far greater estimation of their own importance. 'Twas thus he understood Mr. Arabin's allusion to his severity, and hastened to put matters right by observing that Sexton Clawheave looked at the young uns, and perhaps sometimes there may be a thought too much stick going on during the sermon. Mr. Arabin's bright eyes twinkled as he caught that of the Archdeacon's, and he smiled to himself as he observed how ignorant his officers were of the nature of their authority, and of the surveillance with which their duty to keep an eye over himself. Mr. Arabin read the lesson and preached. It was enough to put a man a little out, let him be ever so used to pulpit reading, to see the knowing way in which the farmers cocked their ears, and set about a mental criticism as to whether their new minister did or did not fall short of the excellence of him who had been lately departed from them. A mental and silent criticism it was for the existing moment, but soon to be made public among the elders of St. Ewald's over the green graves of their children and forefathers. The excellence, however, of poor old Mr. Goodenough had not been wonderful, and there were few there who did not deem that Mr. Arabin did his work sufficiently well, in spite of the slightly nervous affection which impeded him, and which nearly drove the Archdeacon beside himself. But the sermon was the thing to try the man. It often surprises us that very young men can muster courage to preach for the first time to a strange congregation. How do they do it? They're only 20-something, talking to people who are 60, 70, and 80. Men who are as yet but little more than boys, who have but just left what indeed we may not call a school, but a seminary intended for their tuition as scholars, whose thoughts have been mostly of boating, cricketing, and wine parties, ascend a rostrum high above the heads of a submissive crowd, not that they may read God's word to those below, but that they may preach their own word to the edification of their hearers. It seems strange to us that they are not stricken dumb by the new and awful solemnity of their position. How am I, just turned 23, who have never yet passed 10 thoughtful days since the power of thought first came to me? How am I to instruct these graybeards, who with the weary thinking of so many years have approached so near to the grave? Oh, oh, I'll try to mark it in the title. Can I teach them of their duty? Can I explain to them that which I so perfectly and imperfectly understand, that which years of study have made so plain to them? Has my newly acquired privilege as one of God's ministers imparted to me as yet any fitness for the wonderful work of a preacher? It must be supposed that such ideas do occur to young clergymen, and yet they overcome, apparently with ease, this difficulty with which to us appears to be all but insurmountable. We have never been subjected in any way, we have never been subjected in the way of ordination to the power of a bishop's hands. It may be that there is in them something that sustains the spirit and banishes the natural modesty of youth. But for ourselves, we must own that the deep affection which Dominie Sampson felt for his young pupils had no more endeared him to us than the bashful spirit which sent him mute and inglorious from the pulpit when he rose there with the futile attempt to preach God's gospel. And that mention of Dominie Sampson, you don't need to worry about it. It's once again Trollope referring to Sir Walter Scott, who you have to keep in mind, these aren't woolly old scholarly illusions. Scott was the best-selling novelist in the world. Everyone knew Ivanhoe or Guy Mannering or whatever. So a novelist could get away with simply referring to characters there. Same with the reference to Squire Weston. I don't agree with it. I don't think a novelist should do that for this very reason, because it requires a footnote in a century. But you don't need to worry about it at all. The point of that paragraph was simply those two paragraphs was simply Trollope's narrator wondering how on earth young men at 22 and 23 find the nerve or the courage to get up into that pulpit and lecture to an audience of people who presumably have been reading and studying the Bible longer than they've been alive. And the reason why the narrator is expanding on that is because that's what Mr. Arabin is doing. He is doing that for the first time at St. Ewold's, and he is nervous. That's all. That's all you have to know. There is a rule in our church which forbids the younger order of our clergymen to perform a certain portion of the service. The absolution must be read by the ministers in priest's orders. If there be no such minister present, the congregation can have the benefit of no absolution but that which may succeed in administering to himself. The rule may be a good one, though the necessity of it hardly comes home to the general understanding. But this forbearance on the part of youth would be much more appreciated if it were extended likewise to sermons. The only danger would be that congregations would be too anxious to prevent their young clergymen from advancing themselves in the ranks of the ministry. Clergymen who could not preach would be such blessings that they would be bribed to adhere to their incompetence. And that is Trollope, again, he's done this a couple of times in this book so far, just mocking sermons. It's just what a trial they are to a church-going congregation. Listen to Mr. Harding sing? Sure. Listen to someone read the gospel? Sure. But a sermon? He's saying here, if young clergymen really weren't allowed to give a sermon, they'd be incredibly popular. Mr. Arabin, however, had not the modesty of youth to impede him, and he succeeded with his sermon even better than with the lessons. He took for his text 2 verses out of the second epistle of St. John. Whosoever transgresseth, and abideth not in the doctrine of Christ, hath not God. He that abideth in the doctrine of Christ, he hath both Father and Son. If there come any unto you to bring not this doctrine, receive him not into your houses, neither bid him Godspeed. He told them that the house of theirs to which he alluded was their own church, in which he now addressed them for the first time, and that their most welcome and proper manner of bidding him Godspeed would be their patient obedience to his teaching of the gospel. But that he could put forward no claim to such conduct on their part unless he taught them the great Christian doctrine of works and faith combined. On this he enlarged, but not very amply, and after 20 minutes succeeded in sending his new friends home to their baked mutton and pudding, well pleased with their new minister. Wouldn't want him to preach hellfire and brimstone like Mr. Slope did. Wouldn't want to keep them over long. They've got Sunday meals to go to. They like what they hear. Then came the lunch at Ullathorne. This is only the day's first service. There's going to be another one. Then came the lunch at Ullathorne. As soon as they were in the hall, again with the hall, no sooner take your boots off than you're in the hall. Okay, got it. Miss Thorne took Mr. Arabin's hand and assured him that she received him into her house, into the temple, she said, in which she worshipped, and bade him Godspeed with all her heart. Mr. Arabin was touched and squeezed the spinster's hand without uttering a word in reply. Then Mr. Thorne expressed a hope that Mr. Arabin found the church easy to fill, and Mr. Arabin having replied that he found no doubt he should do so as soon as he had learned to pitch his voice to the building, they all sat down to the good things before them. Is church easy to fill? In other words, not to fill the pews, but can you get your voice all the way back to the room? And he's learning. He's figuring out how to do that. Miss Thorne took special care of Mrs. Bold. Eleanor still wore her widow's weeds, and therefore had about her that air of grave and sad maternity which is the lot of recent widows. This opened the soft heart of Miss Thorne, and made her look on her young guest as though too much could not be done for her. She heaped chicken and ham upon her plate, and poured out a full bumper of port wine. When Eleanor, who was not sorry to get it, had drunk a little of it, Miss Thorne at once essayed to fill it again. To this Eleanor objected, but in vain. Miss Thorne winked and nodded and whispered, saying that it was the proper thing and must be done, and that she knew all about it, and so she desired Mrs. Bold to drink it up and not mind anybody. My kind of hostess. It is your duty, you know, to support yourself, she said into the ear of the young mother. There's more than yourself depending on it. And thus she cautioned up, and that's a weird provincial term that Trollope uses for pampering. But again, you don't need a footnote, and you don't need me to tell you that. Trust your ability to read context. It is easy to tell what that word means, even though I'd be willing to bet you've never encountered it before. And thus she cautioned up Eleanor with cold fowl and port wine. How it is that poor men's wives, who have no cold fowl nor port wine on which to be cautioned up, nurse their children without difficulty, whereas the wives of rich men, who eat and drink everything that is good, cannot do so, we will for the present leave to the doctors and the mothers to settle between them. Way to be a buzzkill, Tony. It's a pleasant Sunday meal. The poor you will have always with you. Me you have only for the course of this novel. Anyway. And then Miss Thorne was great about teeth. Little Johnny Bold had been troubled for the last few days with his first incipient masticator, and with that freemasonry which exists among ladies, Miss Thorne became aware of the fact before Eleanor had half finished her wing. The old lady prescribed at once a receipt which had been much in vogue in the young days of her grandmother, and warned Eleanor with solemn voice against the fallacies of modern medicine. Take his coral, my dear, she said, and rub it well with carrot juice. Rub it till the juice dries on it, then give it to him to play with. But he hasn't got a coral, said Eleanor. Has not got a coral, said Thorne, with almost angry vehemence. Not got a coral? How can you expect that he shall cut his teeth? Have you at least got Daffy's elixir? Eleanor explained that she had not. It had not been ordered by Mr. Rarechild, the Barchester doctor whom she employed, and the young mother mentioned some shockingly modern medicine which Mr. Rarechild's new light had taught him to recommend. Miss Thorne looked awfully severe. Take care, my dear, she said, that the man knows what he is about. Take care he doesn't destroy your little boy. But, and she softened into sorrow as she said it, and spoke more in pity than in anger, but I don't know who there is in Barchester now that you can trust. Poor old Dr. Bumpwell, indeed. Why, Miss Thorne, he died when I was a little girl. Yes, my dear, he died. An unfortunate day it was for Barchester. As to those young men who have come up since, Mr. Rarechild, by the by, was quite as old as Miss Thorne herself. One doesn't know where they came from, or who they are, or whether or not they know anything about their business. I think there are some very clever men in Barchester, said Helena. Perhaps there may be, only I don't know them. And it's admitted on all sides that medical men now aren't what they used to be. They used to be talented, observing, educated men, but now any whippersnapper out of an apothecary shop can call himself a doctor. I believe no kind of education is now thought necessary. Eleanor was herself the widow of a medical man and felt a little inclined to resent all these hard sayings. But Miss Thorne was so essentially good-natured that it was impossible to resent anything she said. She therefore sipped her wine and finished her chicken. At any rate, my dear, you don't forget the carrot juice, and by all means get him a coral at once. Where's the baby? We're going to go up there? Go up there? Go on. No? Okay. Anyway, where were we here? Get him a coral at once. My grandmother Thorne had the best teeth in the county, and carried them to the grave with her at 80. I've heard her say that it was all carrot juice. She couldn't bear the Barchester doctors. Even poor old Dr. Bumpwell didn't please her. It clearly never occurred to Miss Thorne that some 50 years ago Dr. Bumpwell was only a rising man, and therefore as much in need of character in the eyes of the then ladies of Ullathorne as the present doctors were in her own. She just mired in an absolutely fanatical worship of the past. Anything that is long ago is much better than anything that is now. The Archdeacon made a very good lunch and talked to his host about turnip drillers and new machines for reaping, while the host, thinking it only polite to attend to a stranger, and fearing that perhaps he might not care about turnip crops on a Sunday, mooted all manner of ecclesiastical subjects. I never saw a heavier lot of wheat, Thorne, than you've got there in that field beyond the copse. I suppose that's guano, said the Archdeacon. Yes, guano. I get it from Bristol myself, in case you can't tell from context here. Guano is poop. It's bird poop. They're talking about fertilizer. Yes, guano. I get it from Bristol myself. You'll find you often have a tolerable congregation of Barchester people out here, Mr. Arabin. They are fond of St. Ewolds, particularly of an afternoon when the weather is not too hot for the walk. I am under an obligation to them for staying away today, at any rate, said the vicar. The congregation can never be too small for a maiden sermon. I got 1.5 tons at Bradley's in High Street, said the Archdeacon, and it was a complete take-in. I don't believe there were 500 weight of guano in it. he's gone straight back to talking about guano. That Bradley never has anything good, Miss Thorne said, who had just caught the name during her whispering to Eleanor. And such a nice shop it used to be in the very house that came before. Wilford, don't you remember what good things Mr. Abeloff used to have? There have been 3 men since Abeloff's time, said the Archdeacon, and each as bad as the other. But who gets it for you at Bristol, Thorne? I ran up myself this year and bought it out of the ship. I'm very afraid that as the evenings get shorter, Mr. Arabin, you will find the reading desk too dark. I must send a fellow with an axe to make him lop off some of those branches. Mr. Arabin declared that the morning light at any rate was perfect, and deprecated any interference with the lime trees. And then they took a stroll out among the trim parterres, and Mr. Arabin explained to Mrs. Bull the difference between a naiad and a dryad, because you've got stone statues of all of them, all these mythological creatures out on the grounds, and dilated on vases and shapes of urns. Miss Thorne busied herself among her pansies, and her brother, finding it quite impracticable to give anything of a peculiarly Sunday tone to the conversation, abandoned the attempt and had it out with the Archdeacon about Bristol guano. At 3 o'clock they again went into the church, because you spend your Sunday going to church. You see everybody in the morning, you go to church, hear a nice sermon, see everybody, socialize with everybody, walk out and about when you're not working, when you're not nose down in your job. And then you go home to a wonderful meal. You go home to the meal that the family looks forward to all week. You put out extra food, you relax, you have a fine time, you've got relatives in, you tell stories, and then in the afternoon you go back to church, maybe to a different church. Hear another sermon, hear another lecture, hear more readings, and then you go home to your Sunday ease. It was a whole of a day that you did. Just so you know that in the 21st century, it's going to seem a little strange, but it's not. Trollope is not saying here that the people of St. Ewolds or of Barchester are hyper religious. This is just what you did. At 3 o'clock, they again went into church, and now Mr. Arabin read the service and the Archdeacon preached. Nearly the same congregation was present, with some adventurous pedestrians from the city who had not thought the heat of midday August sun too great to deter them. The Archdeacon took his text from the Epistle of Philemon. I beseech thee for my son Onesimus, whom I have begotten in my bonds. That's a quote from the text. From such a text it may be imagined the kind of sermon which Dr. Grantley preached, and on the whole it was neither dull, nor bad, nor out of place. The passage about Onesimus is about a slave named Onesimus who converts to Christianity. And St. Paul, the foremost avatar of Christianity at the time, the foremost spokesman of it, is very grateful that he converts to Christianity, and then orders him sent back to his slave master. He told them that it became his duty to look about for a pastor for them, to supply the place of one who had been so long among them, and that in this manner he regarded as a son him whom he selected. Better a son than a slave. This is a clear... Anyway, as St. Paul had regarded the young disciple whom he sent forth. Sent forth, sent back. He sends Onesimus back to slavery. He has absolutely no problem with the institution of slavery. Nor does any of the New Testament, nor does any of the Old Testament. But anyway, then he took a little merit to himself for having studiously provided the best man he could without reference to patronage or favor. But he did not say that the best man, according to his view, was he who was best able to subdue Mr. Slope and make that gentleman's situation in Barchester too hot to be comfortable. Although, if Archdeacon Grantley had said that, most of the people in the audience would have warmed to it. They would have rubbed their hands together because they don't like Slope any more than Grantley does. That he could almost have said that out loud and won a lot of converts. As to the bonds, they had consisted in the exceeding struggle which he had made to get the good clergymen for them. He deprecated any comparison between himself and St. Paul, but said that he was entitled to beseech them for their goodwill towards Mr. Arabin in the same manner that the apostle had besought Philemon to his household with regards to Onesimus, which has been the kind of beneficent, soft-pedaling interpretation of that passage in St. Paul that has always obtained. And yet, that's not what the passage says. Onesimus is a slave. St. Paul has the complete ability to free him, and instead sends him back to his master. The Archdeacon's sermon text, blessing and all, was concluded within half an hour. Another note that struck, these guys are quick. They want to keep the congregation on their side, so don't go on and on. Then they shook hands with their Ullathorne friends and returned to Plumstead. 'Twas thus that Mr. Arabin read himself in at St. Ewald's. And at least, when they shake hands with the Ullathornes, we don't get a trip back to Ullathorne Court so that we can once again hear about the hall. It's right there inside the door. What on earth are they thinking? At least we don't get that. So that is that chapter. A very sedate thing. In any chapter of a novel like this, you would ordinarily wonder, what is the point? What is Trollope trying to do in this chapter? I want to stress that kind of question is really better applied to a novel that is written as a novel and bought as a novel. You run into treacherous ground if you ask that kind of question every chapter about a work that was done in serialization. Because when works are done in serialization, as any of you will know who have ever followed some ill-taken booktube advice and plunged into the mysteries of Paris, works that are done in serialization often have chapters, sometimes many, many chapters, that don't have any point at all. This one does have a few points. It's mainly meant as very mild comedy that talk about where the conversation shifts from ecclesiastical matters to bird guano is one example of very mild comedy. The chat about baby remedies between Eleanor Bold and old Miss Thorne is another very mild kind of comedy. It's mainly just, I think, a make-weight chapter. But Mr. Slope appears next time, and he's not in any make-weight chapters, so we'll see what happens as we move on. So I'll see you next time for our Barchester Towers. Thank you, BookTube.